Hello, and welcome to today's Wellness Webinar. My name is Shane Drossi, and I am the Wellness Coordinator at NAMI San Diego. Before I begin today's Wellness Webinar, I'd like to point out a few housekeeping notes. In the upper right-hand corner of your YouTube screen, you will see an eye with a circle around it. If you click on that eye, it would allow you to engage in a short poll that we've created for this video. There's a link to the Tech Cafe homepage, and also the option to donate directly to NAMI San Diego. In addition, we'd love for you to engage with us on social media, so follow us on Twitter and Facebook at NAMI San Diego. Today's interview is with Bill Brown, who is the Director of Projects for Prison Yoga Project here in San Diego. And without further ado, here is the interview. Hello, how are you doing today, Bill?
Great. Wonderful. You?
Very well, thank you. To begin, would you tell me a little bit about yourself and your background?
Sure. My name's Bill Brown, and I'm a yoga therapist and trauma-informed yoga teacher. I'm also the Director of Programs for Prison Yoga Project in San Diego.
Okay. Can you tell me a little bit about Prison Yoga Project?
Prison Yoga Project was founded 14 years ago by a man named James Fox at San Quentin State Prison outside of San Francisco. And we bring yoga as a mindfulness-based practice into prisons and jails. And in San Diego, we've been in operation for about the last 4 years. Most of the people who wind up in a prison or jail have experienced some background of trauma, and are living with PTSD. And then the circumstances of prison are themselves can be very traumatizing. And so we bring it in as a way for them to start to unravel the trauma that they're carrying in their body and find ways to manage the stress that they're encounter on a daily basis.
So what does it look like being in an environment with people that are incarcerated, bringing like a mindfulness practice into that kind of negative, traumatic environment?
It varies really depending on the institution. We work in both prisons and in the San Diego County jails, and the jail system is actually fairly progressive here in San Diego. And so when we go into places like I teach at both San Diego Central Jail and East Mesa Reentry Facility, it's really embraced, I think, by the guys that participate. The deputies use last names. I always call guys by their first names. So we get in there, and it's actually a really casual feel to it. It looks different than what yoga in a studio might look like. Looks different than what yoga in a studio might look like. It's a lot more free environment. You go into a yoga studio and everybody's quiet and sitting, on their mats, and then you go to class and there's not a lot of interaction. And then at the end, everybody packs up and maybe there's a little socializing and they leave. And in a class in a jail, everybody is a little bit more talkative. And I think the thing that shocks a lot of new teachers as they get started is that, you'll be in the middle of class and people will say, I feel it in my legs, feels good, or it's like, oh yeah, that's great, So it's a lot. People are a lot more vocal, a lot more sharing. There's a lot of laughter, actually, as well. So
that's awesome.
Yeah.
So what kind of is the structure of a session in a prison?
Well, we usually try and allow for about an hour and a half to 2 hours. Go in, usually there's some amount of setup of the room. The guys grab their mats and we set up in a circle rather than in rows. I practice along with them rather than, being at the front. I stay on my mat, not moving around. And all of these are informed by trauma-informed principles. Setting up in a circle avoids having anybody, behind you.
Mm.
So you can see the whole room. Um, me not getting up and moving around, it's like nobody's worried. They know where I am. They know
Right.
where I am. They don't have to look around for me if they need to see me. Um, the practice itself varies quite a bit from what you might encounter in a studio. We uh, start with every prison yoga project teacher is going to approach it a little bit differently, but the idea is to get you into your body and to use mindfulness of what's happening in the body as a way of reassociating with the body, because a lot of the effect of trauma is to send you off. You're not really engaged in the present moment in an embodied sense. So we start with meditative grounding practice. And then there's a lot of cueing around noticing what's happening for you, in your body, noticing the parts of your body that are touching the ground, paying attention to the sensation of discharge, if we're in a difficult pose where there's a long hold and then we come out of it. Rather than moving straight into the next pose, we'll spend some time to notice the sensation of that discharging from the body, the stretch or the engagement of the hold. And then there's an emphasis on recovering, a sense of personal agency. So really, I want to inquire, you might have in a studio a teacher say, you can do it, you've got this. I'm going to encourage them to, if we're holding a plank, for instance, and if you'd like to, you can come down to your knees, or you can come all the way out of the pose. We're going to meet on our stomachs. And so that they have a sense of, they get to choose for themselves what is within their, window of tolerance. I'm not going to try and push them. I'm going to try and encourage them to make their own choices that are best for them. Yeah.
So, taking a step back, what does being trauma informed mean to you?
I think when we're talking about trauma informed, you have to understand that trauma is on one end of the spectrum of a very natural stress response that we all have. Our bodies and our nervous system is built to keep us safe. And for much of our evolutionary history, threats were physical. And so we've got a nervous system that is able to respond to a physical threat by engaging and activating the body before we're even consciously aware that there is that the threat is there for us. So if we're crossing the street and a car is coming, our body can be stepping back out of the way before our visual cortex has even recognized that there's a car there. So it's this very quick path that served us very well. I mean, we're very successful as a species. We've made it this far. But in our current world, we're faced with a lot of stress that's not necessarily the result of a physical threat, but our bodies are still reacting in that way. So we're all engaged in a world where there's a certain level of stress that's not necessarily natural for us. And over time, that can have an accumulative effect on the system, and that stress gets stored in the body if it's not discharged. So there's a level of toxic stress. And in certain communities where there's, say, discrimination or poverty, that stress can be overwhelming. Then you also have traumatic events that happen, and we all experience trauma at some point where we're faced with some sort of threat that becomes overwhelming, and our ability to either fight off that threat or get ourselves away can be inhibited. And then the response that our body is engaged in becomes sort of stuck. So we're living with our nervous system tuned as though we're constantly under threat at that point, and that's what we call post-traumatic stress. Okay. Right. So to be trauma informed means recognizing how widespread trauma can be, trauma and toxic stress, and then understanding the impact of that trauma on a person, and then using that understanding to adapt the practice to help people better manage their stress resiliency, and then also start to unwind some of the physiological effect and psychological effect of the traumatic stress being stuck in the body. So it's an adaptation of whatever practice, be it yoga, it's an adaptation of the yoga practice to maximize healing from trauma and to build stress resiliency.
So have you found yoga to be a good remedy for trauma?
The greatest benefit that comes in teaching trauma-informed yoga, it works by bringing somebody into a state where we're engaging the sympathetic nervous system. So we may be holding a challenging pose like chair pose, where what we're doing is we're intentionally putting the body into a stressful situation, but in a controlled environment where we can start to explore what the window of tolerance is. Mm. So as you hold a pose like chair, which you're involving big muscles in your legs and your arms, and your heart rate starts to go up, and you start to have lactic acid buildup and that burning sensation in the legs, you can use the breath as a way of regulating the nervous system so that we stay, our minds can stay in a calm state, and we're able to use that ability to concentrate and bring mindfulness of what's happening in the body into the situation. So we can start to explore what is it like to be in a stressful condition? How does our body respond? What are we noticing in the body? And using the breath, maintain emotional regulation at that point, up to the point where we say, okay, you know what, this is not for me anymore. Mm-hmm. And then we'll move into a pose like a forward fold, which naturally is a relaxing pose. We're bringing the head below the heart, stimulating the vagus nerve, and then this is sending signals to the brain that starts to slow everything down. So we're moving from a sympathetic, arousal back into a parasympathetic relaxation state. So what we're doing is we're moving that switch. So if you think of living with post-traumatic stress as the switch is always on alert, always ready to fight, always ready to flee, mm-hmm. And we're stuck there. So what we do is we just start with the yoga practice, moving back and forth between those two states, moving between a state of engagement and a state of relaxation, and paying attention to both. And the idea being that one, you create more fluidity between those two states just naturally. But then when a trigger happens, and this specifically like with people who wind up in prison or jail, there's often, there could be impulse control, anger management issues, addiction issues. So when you feel triggered, if you can notice that sensation in your body and then maintain your sense of being grounded, your connection to the earth, your sense of being in tune with your breath, you're able to stay with the feeling rather than reacting out of impulse.
So what has been the response of individuals that are living with trauma when you engage with them in yoga?
Yeah, one of the reasons why I love teaching with Prison Yoga Project specifically is because I get to see a lot of people who are first-time yoga students. Mm. And for somebody who is living with trauma, living with post traumatic stress, it's as though there's like a really gross layer, like an armoring that's there. And when you start to take that off, the you know the feeling can be profound. So there can be some very dramatic shifts early on. I think for myself, when I went to my first yoga class, I was 40 years old, overweight, not living a healthy lifestyle at all. And I got to my first yoga class and I got into a pose called pigeon, which is an intense hip stretch. And I'm in pigeon, and all of a sudden, just a flood of tears comes. And I don't know where it's happening, right? Wind up again in Savasana, which is corpse pose, the final resting pose that you come to in a class. And once again, start crying, out of the blue, unexpected. And that's what really got my interest in yoga going. I really wanted to understand, well, one, it felt so good. Mm-hmm. It was a release, and then so I walked out of the studio and I signed up for a membership, and I started going 3-4 times a week. It wound up, 8 times a week at some point, because it felt so good. And then I wanted to know why was I having this emotional release? And to make a long story short, years later, after I'd done a yoga teacher training and then gotten into my yoga therapy training, we were doing a pose called legs to sides, where the practitioner is just pulling traction on the leg. So as the practitioner was holding my leg, we were doing exchanges with partners. I noticed that I was lifting my right hip up off the ground as she was pulling on my right leg. Now, the same side that I had the emotional experience going into with pigeon. So I thought, well, what if I was to relax my hip down? I don't understand why I'm holding my hip up. So at that moment that I relaxed my hip and I stopped assisting her, it wasn't a flashback, but a recovered memory. And I was 3 or 4 years old, and I had broken my femur, my right femur. And I went into the hospital, and they had put me in a cast from ankle to mid-waist and back down past the other knee. And they'd wrapped bandages around my feet to hold my legs up in traction. And they'd wrapped the bandages too tight, and they cut off blood flow to my feet. And so I was getting gangrene on my foot. And of course, there's the downward pressure of the bandages that are there to hold my legs up. Mm-hmm. And so for 3 or 4 days, well, the doctor said, oh, of course he's fine. Of course he's uncomfortable. Everything's fine. I was lifting my leg up to try to relieve the pressure and the pain of this very real physical threat. And it was a situation you can imagine, 3 or 4 years old, part of my body is dying. I'm complaining about it, but nobody's listening. So it's like, this is a classic traumatic experience. And this was something that became overwhelming to my system, and I wasn't able to process in the time. And so it becomes stored in that gripping, in that holding sensation that's there in the right hip. So it's a very acute situation where trauma is being held in the body, a very specific event that happened over 3 to 4 days, where my own system was no longer processing what was going on, but it was being held there. And so as I relaxed that muscle, the memories recovered. So it wasn't like a flashback. It was like experiencing it for the first time and being back in there. And over time, I've come to realize that, well, this holding here is sending a signal that's coming back up to my brain that is that there's something wrong, there's some sort of danger, something's not right, something's not right, something's not right. And so that was how I had lived my life for 40 years almost, with that feeling of being under threat and like something's not okay. And uh, it had created, the circumstances in my life, my PTSD symptoms, you know, um, anger management, definitely addictive tendencies, uh, these things, until I had been able to release that out of my body, it was as though nothing was going to help. Yeah. I could consciously remember and talk about what had happened, but when I talked about that accident and the complications that followed, it was an uncontrollably emotional experience. And I would cry and cry and cry. And there was also a lot of self pity. And in the moment of remembering and really letting that go, I was processing it consciously, but my body was still held there. So the letting go needed to happen from the body. And like I can tell this story now without breaking down in tears. Right. Yeah. Because I'm not living in that moment anymore. That moment's not being held in my body. Yeah.
So what you're doing is almost helping individuals that are storing that negative energy or that conditioned trauma to be able to accept it and release that from their body.
Yeah, yeah, and it starts with bringing awareness to it. It's noticing those areas where your body is holding on to tension, and usually my situation, with the accident with my leg was very acute. Usually it's not so acute. Usually it's a much more chronic condition that people are living with, and so the body, it's not necessarily as localized. But yeah, getting in touch with where the body's holding on to the tension, and then working with the yoga to help to let some of that go. Yeah.
So a lot of people that work here at NAMI are peers, people living with mental illness or family members living with mental illness, and they help individuals living with mental illness. You just mentioned that you live with PTSD. So yeah. What I guess what advantages do you think there is of being a peer and working with other individuals that are experiencing something that you experienced in your own life?
I feel like when you've been through something yourself, you're better able to meet who you're working with on an empathetic level. Mm-hmm. And I really feel like underneath all of it, with that empathetic connection is what creates a holding space for healing to happen. Mm-hmm. And you're better able to meet the person with unconditional positive regard, to borrow Carl Rogers' term, rather than wanting to fix somebody, rather than wanting somebody's anger to go away and trying to give them tools to make it go away, for instance, understanding that there's something underlying that anger, that nobody wants to live in that kind of state, and accepting that this is a strategy and a mechanism that they've developed to help them survive in the world, as best they know how. Yeah, so to have been to have walked that path before, I think helps with acceptance and the empathetic connection. Yeah, I think peer to peer work is essential. It was a question for me when I went in to start doing yoga in prison and saying, well, I've never been in prison. I've never been arrested. Where do I, what gives me the right to go into that environment? And what I found is that, well, we all have similar experiences.
So, what is the end goal of the Prison Yoga Project, or what is the mission of the Prison Yoga Project?
Well, the mission of the Prison Yoga Project is to give the people that we work with some tools so that they're better able to manage their lives, both on the inside and when they're released back into community. Um, for me, I'm not looking to create yogis.
Mm.
If these guys get out of class and they never practice you know, another minute of yoga, that's okay with me. Um, what what I would like to know is that in a moment when somebody is feeling activated, that they're able to notice. They've strengthened their ability to concentrate and be mindful of what's happening in their body so that they can notice their reaction and then in that moment find a way of grounding down, find a way of connecting to their breath, and then choose uh, how they'd like to respond to the situation rather than just go down that pattern reactive pathway. Yeah.
So, what do you do to maintain your own personal wellness when dealing with trauma on a daily basis, whether it is for yourself or with others?
So for me, maintaining personal wellness, um, I try to practice some form of mindfulness every day, and it may not always be yoga. More often than not now, meditation, um, but it's a daily thing, and if you think about it, you wouldn't get up in the morning and head out to your day without brushing your teeth. It's just something that you do. And I think that given the atmosphere of stress that we live in, the stressful environment of being in the modern world, um, we need to develop routines and habits of mental hygiene.
Mm.
So for me, that's what this is about. And I will notice very often, you know, uh, if I'm in a situation that feels stressful, I'll go in and I'll notice what's happening with my body. I'll notice if my jaw is clenched, in particular. This shows up for me, and it shows up for a lot of people. And just being able to be aware of those moments when you're in stress, and then doing something, taking a conscious breath, uh, relaxing your jaw just a little bit, can help to unwind just right in the moment, to unwind. So a lot of it is just building up an awareness, and then doing. It doesn't have to be going to a yoga class in a studio. It can be sitting at your desk and noticing your shoulders hunched, and in noticing your shoulders hunched, just choosing to relax them or to do something in order to start to let go and unwind some of that tension before it accumulates. So for me, it's been about developing mini practices that happen throughout the day. And I love to get into a studio because that also connects me in with a community. And of course, uh, fear, shame, addiction all thrive in the shadows. And so bringing yourself into a community and connecting with a community. So I try to get to a class at least every third day to engage in that way, uh, you know. But to not have to wait for that moment to take care of myself, to recognize it, in the moment as close to the trigger as I can, and work with it there.
I really like the idea of that, like mini mindfulness moments, just
Yeah,
throughout the day as it comes up, seeing it, understanding it, accepting it, and releasing it.
yeah, yeah. And I love that mini mindfulness moments, seeing it, understanding it, and accepting it, and you know it makes it that habitual thing, so that it's a way of being rather than like rather than, it's like if you keep the house clean, like if you clean up as you go, You don't have to make a huge project out of cleaning the house down the road. Yeah, yeah. And there are a lot of mini mindfulness things that you can do. Very simple to just pause and take note of the parts of your body that are touching the ground. You know, so I can feel my seat on the chair. I can feel my feet on the ground. Then you can expand out from there. I notice my hands resting on my thighs. Easy to go into the breath from that point. And I can feel the shift already, just in a simple grounding. Taking a conscious breath. And there are wonderful apps for this. Mindfulness Bell is a good one that will, you can set it to periodically set off a chime on your phone. And when that goes off, you can, whatever practice, whether it's a grounding practice or taking 3 conscious breaths, just noticing what sort of state you're in at that moment. And it really does begin with that noticing. We don't, it would be wonderful to feel good all the time, but it's not a realistic expectation. And just noticing the reality of the situation that we're in is often enough. We don't have to make a big effort to unwind whatever the situation is. Noticing in a way that is without judgment.
Stay tuned to the next wellness webinar for the conclusion of this interview.